2NURFM, a broadcast service of the University of Newcastle.
And right after the long weekend, we've got to welcome this guy back, Professor Jim Jost. What a couple of days it's been in the world of politics.
Yeah, good morning, Mark.
Look, we're going to shift away from Australia for today. We're going to have a look at the UK and that snap election that was presented by PM Theresa May. And you've got to say that her job's got to be on the line.
Well, she took a gamble, attempted to get an increased majority, stamp her authority on the party, and basically get herself in a strong political position. In terms of stamping her authority, she failed to get, in fact, she lost seats in the House. So instead of increasing her majority in the House, the Conservative Party ended up with only 318 seats, a little short of the 326 needed for a majority, but well short of where she expected to be. The Labor Party also increased its share of votes and the number of seats in the House. Curiously, both parties, both the Conservative Party and the Labor Party, increased their share of the national vote. So the Conservative Party got another 5% on to a pretty high proportion of 42% of the vote, and the Labor Party increased its share of the vote by another 9%. So you had actually both major parties increasing their share of the national vote, Mark, and that's sort of quite interesting because it goes against the trend in some respects that people were moving away from the major parties and taking up with the minor parties. And it seemed that in the UK elections there was a much more strategic move back to the major parties. The Labor Party had a surge of support, and that, I think, is largely attributable to Jeremy Corbyn. And I think it's really interesting that he's represented as a liability for the Labor Party, yet for many voters he was seen as the breath of fresh air, someone who was prepared to stand up for the ordinary wage earners and the downtrodden in Britain and give them something, to hope for.
I was also a little surprised, because you mentioned the major parties have both done relatively well out of this, that the minor parties didn't seem to rate much of a mention. I would have thought the likes of UKIP and others may have, particularly with this election, may have seen a little bit of a rise, a little bit of a bump, but that may not have necessarily been the case.
Well, the UKIP party, the UK Independence Party, it basically ended up with no seats in the House. The Scottish National Party held its own, it didn't increase, and stayed pretty steady. The Greens lost a little bit, but they ended up with a member in the House. The Democratic Unionist Party, which is the one that Theresa May is looking to form an alliance with to hold on to government, they had a slight increase. I think they ended up with about 10 or 11 seats in the House, and they're the party that she's looking to, she hopes will provide the Conservative Party with a degree of support on the big issues like backing the budget, getting supply. But it's still a risk for her because the Northern Ireland peace accords are very precarious. There's been a bit of unravelling in the past 6 months, and the Democratic Unionist Party is very conservative. So there's a bit of a worry that they may help push the actual Conservative government into a much more narrow position. Whether Theresa May can withstand that is another matter. In fact, whether she can withstand the challenges to her leadership, because that's really the thing that's probably the big issue at the moment.
Yeah, that is, whenever that happens, like when she's rolled the dice, she's taken the gamble, and it hasn't really worked out as she would hope. So there'll be a lot of people there waiting for their turn. The most interesting of those names that have been put forward, of course, was Boris Johnson, and he's come out publicly and in the party and said, look, I'm not interested. Do you buy this?
Only insofar as he's saying that publicly. We're not inside the party room yet, and I think once the party goes into its closed-door sessions, it's likely that the dynamics will re-emerge and things will change, and he may well be persuaded that his hat should be in the ring, which is probably where he wants it, but is wanting to be pushed towards that decision rather than being seen to be running towards it. The interesting thing is that, for me anyway, was the way in which the leader of the Labor Party, Jeremy Corbyn, was represented And I think that there was he was represented very negatively. Quite a few newspapers were just simply totally hostile to him. The general perception that was being presented was that he was not popular, certainly not popular by some of the parliamentary members of his own party because they were much more conservative. But what seemed to be underestimated was the degree of both rank and file support in the Labor Party and the willingness of the voters to actually countenance some of the reforms that Jeremy Corbyn was promoting, which were presented to us as radically dangerous, but in the historical context were very similar to the sorts of policies that governments around the world, in the Western world at least, pursued in the 1960s and the early 1970s, a sort of mild welfare state type policies. And Corbyn was making the pitch around education, around health, around improving quality of life. And basically, after sort of a decade or so of Conservative government and a couple of decades of the Blair government, people were not confident that the people who have been in Parliament for that long were actually interested in them.
Very interesting times. We will watch this. This one is not over yet. And Jim, we tend to forget that for most part it is a bit of a game, but it's chess, not checkers. Thanks for your time again, Jim.
My pleasure, Mark.
Jim will be back next week with us at 2NURFM 103.7.